Ask all members to mute upon entry because there can be usually around 100 or so folks on the call, and remain muted through the meeting to avoid background noise. We do open up the conversation at times, and we will let you know when that time is. There is a lively chat usually in the conversation, and the moderator, myself or Linda, will try to field questions as folks bring them up in the chat. So please feel free to use the chat. And the chat also becomes a log of things that if people have suggested, and we review the chat after the call to make sure we've captured key elements. The call is being recorded, and we use the recording to review decisions that have been discussed about, and the slides are posted on the Confluence. This is just the Gravity Project antitrust practice. We have to post this as part of our agreement with HL7. This is a continual element on every slide. So when we move through to the next element. So there's a different way to join the project. So if you're new to the project, we invite you to officially join it and, as a member at the Confluence. Almost all of the primary communication we have regarding the Gravity Project happens on that Confluence page. All of our announcements are on that page. All of our domain by domain work is on that page. And there's something on the sidebar where you can find how to officially join it. And then there's another link here below to check whether you've already signed up. And then again, the link on the bottom is to the Confluence in general. Next slide, please. This is our growing list of funders and founders and in-kind support. And these are, again, all detailed on the Confluence for reference. Next slide, please. And then we always want to make sure we are a crowd and ground-funded initiative. So we always make sure to mention that we're seeking additional sponsors. There's a link here to get information about sponsoring. Again, this is all available on the Confluence. You also can just directly write the Gravity Project at our program management organization, EMI Advisors, at gravityproject@emiadvisors.net. Next slide, please. We are hiring a project manager to work with EMI and the team of the project management team. So if you're here, we know you care about addressing social risk and you care about good data. So we're looking for a PM to help organize all of the wings of our project under one project management umbrella. The application is also on the Confluence, or you can email us at hello@emiadvisors.net. And the information about, next slide, this ties in to the next slide. Information about the project management position is also available on social media. We have very limited but emerging social media presence now. We have both a LinkedIn presence and a Gravity Project on Twitter presence. And we are working on creating a public-facing web page with some in-kind support that will allow us to create something that's a little bit less technical than the Confluence for communicating what we do and who we are. So spread the word regarding those social media presences, and you'll see us on the web. Next slide, please. So we have a full, but I think will just be an hour-long agenda. We flex either an hour or an hour and a half, depending on what we have to discuss. Announcements we've just covered. I'm briefly going to just touch base on the roadmap and the upcoming schedule. Linda will update us on housing instability and homelessness concept submission status. I'm going to discuss end-to-end review on housing instability and homelessness interventions. Linda then will detail the status of our inadequate housing, which is our phase 2 of our housing initiative. I'm going to lead then a brief discussion on some issues regarding inadequate housing, and then we'll discuss community homework and next steps. Always at the end from now on, we're including slides that just detail an overview of the terminology development process for any new member. So these slides are on the Confluence at the end of every single presentation. There's a few slides that detail how we do what we do. Next slide, please. So here we are at 7-9. We are doing the end of our phase 1 work, which is our housing instability and homelessness work, and the kind of the middle of our inadequate housing work, which is phase 2 of our housing work. So there's basically 2 different kinds of homework at the same time: reviewing and submitting comments on housing instability and homelessness data elements, and submitting new or novel inadequate housing concepts. Next slide, please. And again, this is just the timeline over time. So you can see here we are at the end of Q2 in 2020. You can see with food insecurity, we are in the submitting the coding concepts that we collectively came up with in 2019. We have a concept submitted to ICD-10, LOINC, and SNOMED. We are in the refinement of our housing instability data set, and in housing instability covering in this timeline both housing instability, homelessness, and inadequate housing. And then you can see at the end of the summer, in the early fall, we'll begin transportation. All along with that work is the work of our fire implementation guide development, which is a project led by our technical director, Bob Dieterle, with lots of in-kind support from the American Medical Association and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Next slide, please. This is just a slide we made. Again, this is part of that overview work. We recognize that because Gravity is kind of a sea of members that come and go as they are able, again, having those overview slides at the end are really important. So this is a slide we'll cover every time, though. It details the intersection of these 2 different streams of work. So what we are talking about today primarily is the identification of data elements and the representation of gaps in data elements, and then submitting new codes. Each of the consensus set of these data recommendations go into value sets, and that speaks to this other wing of work, which is the fire implementation guide. So these 2 works are interdependent. We have to talk back and forth with each other on a regular basis. Our AMA partners are on the call today. So this is just a visual we made to try to represent the parallel and intersecting labor of these 2 deliverables, the terminology and the implementation guide. Next slide, please. Any questions? That's just the overview that we go through each time. Any questions on that? No, and so we will now step forward into the next section. I believe, Linda, I'm handing off the mic to you.
Yes, you are, Sarah. Hello, everybody. What I'm going to take you through right now is just the current status of our submissions for the housing instability and homelessness phase of the project. Again, these are a reminder, these are the organizations that have presented submissions to us for data concepts for this phase. And again, we thank all of them very much for doing this. And based on their submissions and some of the work that Sarah and our subject matter experts from Children's Health Watch have been doing, this is where our submissions stand today. So we actually added a submission since our last meeting. As Sarah mentioned, we do review the chat, and we ask people when Sarah is going over a particular topic to provide us with some feedback, any other concepts that they can think of. So we turned the chat into a submission where Sarah and the SMEs reviewed it, and based on that, we made some additions to the master list. So as you can see now, we have a total of 15 submissions. We've reviewed 15 and we've returned 14. Basically, the last one is the chat, and we still have a couple of questions before we resolve everything that we found from the chat that we put on the submission. This just represents the disposition status of what was added, what we found as a duplicate or a synonymous term that was already on the master across these different 4 activities. Are there any questions about the submission status? Okay, then we will move on to the end-to-end review, and we'll turn it back to Sarah to talk about interventions.
I'm just gonna thank you, Linda. I'm just gonna take a moment to just top load what we're presenting with some of the process for end-to-end review. We talk about it again at the end in your homework, but before I dive into the presentation, I just want to set the stage. So we go through a process where we collectively create a representation across these activities. So we have screening, diagnoses, goal setting, and interventions. That master list, again, lives on the Confluence. There will be a link to it at the end of the presentation. I'm sorry, if you can mute your mic, just so if you're having other conversations, they're not they're muted for here. And then at this phase where we are right now, we present what we've collectively made to the community and do a focused review of it. So this is the end-to-end review. Over the last few meetings, we've presented the information we've gathered for screening. We presented the information we've gathered for housing instability and homelessness regarding goals. We did that last time, and that's again available on the Confluence. And this time we're going to be talking about the interventions work that we've done. Next slide, please. So there's a couple different ways we're presenting this information to you. So this is the way that you'll see it in the intervention summary. So Linda, being amazing, the master list is fairly robust. It can be a little bit confusing to navigate. So Linda makes a summary that is available to be digested and reviewed if you want to specifically focus on something that's a little bit more limited. When you're reflecting on whether comments need to be added, refined, or removed. On some of the elements that we present, it's small enough that we don't make a summary. For example, the diagnoses and goals, there were few enough, but the master list as it stands is the best way to review them. So this is a representation of the Housing Instability Intervention Summary. I'm just going to orient folks a little bit, and you'll see again in some different slides because we try to present things a few different ways. You can see that we created a column this time because we're learning that details the specific noun that the concept is wrapping around. So there's a column for there's a column for program.
It's been what? Locked.
If individuals are not trying to speak to the community, if they could mute their microphones so that we can hear each other. And if not, if you're trying to say something, then please just let us know and we can try to get your voice in. So again, there's a column for programs, professions, and persons. So this is, and I should have put in there, but I didn't, a section for activities, because some of these things are activities. This allows the person that's reviewing the summary to sort just by those. So you can see the actual nouns of the intervention as you're reviewing whether you feel like it's complete. And then each of these programs, professions, persons, and activities are then broken out and sorted into what we created early in our work last year, which is this intervention structure. So there's nouns, there's verbs for assessment, verbs for counseling, education, evaluation of eligibility. So verbs wrap around these nouns and then create a final data concept. So this is what you'll see when you'll go there. And again, we created the program, profession, person column so an individual could sort it to try to wrap their brain around it a little bit easier. Next slide, please. And this is a continuation of it. So you can see it's quite long. So by sorting again in that column, you'll get a really clear sense of the programs, professions, peoples, and activities we're talking about. And you can also then see the activities that are associated with them. Each of those activities have been chosen relative to the noun itself. So if something's not, you don't have to have evaluation of eligibility. We did not choose evaluation of eligibility for that program or person. If that's one of the things that you want to suggest as well, that would be fine. If you feel like we've neglected to add an activity to something that should have an activity, just let us know. Are interventions targeted to the provider assessment or to the patient education? Lucy, can you let us know what you mean, just so I can try to answer the question better?
Yeah, if you go back to the first page, as I was running down the types of interventions, I saw assessment. Obviously, a provider is doing this, if I understand this correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, these are.
And then education. Does education mean the provider is educating the patient about all of these things, or providers need to be educated about all of these things?
These are the provider is offering education about these things, because these are within patient records. So it's denoting an intervention or procedure even that the provider of any type, again, this is agnostic to the profession. So whether you're a clinical nurse specialist or a social worker or a nutritionist or a health or a community, like a community navigator, it's the individual that's working with the person offering the education to the patient.
Okay, so all the interventions are actually providers doing something. They are assessing or coordinating or counseling or educating or whatever.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Next slide, please. Again, what I mentioned is we tried to present the information in different ways so you can see it in the, because we all learn in different ways. So I've just created a snapshot of what happens if you were to sort by programs. So you can see some of the programs we have here: benefits enrollment assistance, community action agencies, community resource networks, fair housing organizations, housing support programs, which is the general parent, legal aid, medical legal partnerships, rental assistance, subsidized housing, tenants' rights organizations. And then there was an additional concept that we actually collectively created here on the call, which is a referral to additional services to maintain housing stability. So these are the things that happen after placement in a different housing program, understanding that engagement and maintaining housing sometimes involves solving other problems or concerns that the individual has. I added, for the sake of reference, on each slide the goals we've agreed upon. We don't yet have the goal that Lucy suggested actually at the last public call, which is this maintenance of the housing of the person desires, or maintenance of the status of the person desires. We're working on wordsmithing that. So expect a fifth goal to come soon, because we have not forgotten that concept. We're trying to figure out how best to say that. And maybe Lucy can help me. Maybe we can have a phone call about that one. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, before we go on, sorry, if we can go back for a second. So sorry. You can see at the top, I've created representations of some of the activities that are common across programs. So we refer to programs, we evaluate eligibility for some of the programs, and we educate about the programs. This is just to make what was on the previous tables a little more concrete, right? So this is how the activity, refer, evaluate eligibility, or educate, intersects with the noun, the program in question. Next slide, please.
And Sarah?
Hi, yeah?
Sarah, just to be clear on the previous, no, this slide is fine. What's ultimately the output of all of this conversation is coding attached to what the provider actually did.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly. Right? 100%.
Okay. Who, tell me if this is totally out of scope, who makes sure that these referrals or educations or whatever the provider is doing actually changes anything for the patient?
You know, Lucy, that's a really good question. So part of when we go around talking about what we do to people that don't know us at all, one of the reasons why we know we need to use this language is to evaluate the efficacy of our interventions from multiple perspectives, right? So Right now, there's many internal processes by which different health systems or different programs evaluate the effectiveness of their interventions according to different priorities. Again, the patient might have a priority, the system might have a priority, but the intent actually, and part of our directive and our work, is to build language that allows us to do that better, right? So once the language is there to represent the things we're doing, we then need to evaluate whether they're actually helping the person. So there's some internal processes regarding that, and then we're hoping to make it better. And there's also policy movements behind that as well, depending on whether it's state policy or quality metrics, for example. But part of doing the responsibility for doing that is hopefully better enabled by building the language that we're making together.
Terrific. Somebody should write that down. It was a very articulate summation of what we hope to happen once we're finished.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.
I learned from you. Lucy's a really good, a good teacher.
Well,
all right.
This is a great classroom. Thank you.
This is a separate slide. I see that some of my really wonderful colleagues in the HMIS HIT subgroup are here on the call today. So one of the things we took care to do early was to ensure that we were representing concepts in the homeless management information system, because who we refer to when someone has housing concerns, that is their wheelhouse. And case management and care management and ongoing commitment to individuals with housing needs is definitely part of that work. So there is a section and a program for section for the programs of HMIS as defined by HUD. So again, refer to, evaluate eligibility for, and educate about coordinated entry, day shelter, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, housing with no services, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, street outreach, and transitional housing. I do want to say initially what we started to think about when we were doing the work with this little subgroup was trying to actually map the questions that are asked within HMIS. But where we're landing now is a next deliverable, because sometimes gravity just creates things it didn't expect to create, is actually assisting intercommunication between clinical and HMIS vendors and care managers about the chronic disease elements that are required for identifying some of the ongoing housing supports for individuals. So some of the programs we see here on this list require assessment of what's disability status. That's information the clinic has that we are trying to build a panel for, or a question and answer set that would allow the clinic to easily commute that data out into community partners. And again, there are 4 goals here, missing that 5th one, but next slide, please. So this is a little profession tab. So far we have, and I might have missed some because it was fairly early in the morning when I was making this slide. We have case manager, care navigator, community nurse specialist, which again was a chat submission from a community member a little while back, referring to lawyers, referring to social workers, and referring to community health workers. And then we did include educate about, because sometimes some of these, if you're engaging a person with services, they really need to understand where they're going. So we did want to create a place and a space for whoever is helping that patient to talk about where you're going, talk about what a care navigator is, what a community health worker is, what social workers do, and what they might expect if they're going to a lawyer. Next slide, please. Again, this is a tab representing some of the activities. So these are not a person or a profession. These are things that are actually just being done. So these are some of our initial suggestions coming through our collaboration, again, with Children's Health Watch and their extensive research and advocacy and policy on children with social risks. So some of the suggestions are provision of non-federal rental assistance voucher, provision of federal tenant-based rental assistance voucher, and these are all linked to policies, which is why they're crafted this way. Provision of federal project-based rental assistance voucher, and then a general provision of emergency housing funds. So these have been on the master for some time. We highlight them here and then really look forward to feedback from the community about these activities. But this, again, this is not something that represents something that is happening outside of that moment in the clinical practice. This is the clinician doing something at that time, whatever they may be. Again, you can imagine this happening in a clinic community partnership as a social worker that might be housed in a community setting, but this is something actually being given at that time. Emergency housing. So Art asked, how do the 4 colored circles relate to the activity? So I took, in trying to understand, again, the goals of the why of what we're doing, I took the liberty of adding the goals we've identified in our goals submission on the previous presentation and bringing them into each slide, because otherwise these data concepts are just kind of static. But if we understand that the goals are housing security, access housing resources, accessing permanent housing, and accessing shelter, all of these interventions then have alignment with those goals. Yes, so this is some of the policy comments. Include supportive housing vouchers. So we should probably, if this is a missing concept, this is what this end-to-end review is for. So perhaps maybe utility vouchers. So what I'm going to ask folks to do, utility vouchers are definitely part of what drives down cost in allowing folks to stay at home, which is how all of these social risks all intervene. So if what I'm wondering is how we should breach. So should I make a submission as we have in the past from the comments in the chat? Does that sound good? And then we can collectively review them from these 2. So we have utility vouchers, which I actually can imagine being broadened to alternate voucher to assist with housing stability, for example. But we can work on that and I'll make the chat into a submission and take that back to the SMEs. And then Art's asking, will a referral make explicit reference to one specific goal or to all combined? Oh, so Art, they can be whatever goal, whatever the person decides. Again, I only put them there just to keep our eyes on the prize. These referrals will usually be linked to diagnoses codes, but with diagnoses codes with the aim of solving the goal. Gabe Kate asked, would the vouchers fall under housing resources? It's possible. Do we want to, what time is it? I think we have time to actually unmute and just have a little more of a conversation regarding this. So we have, I think, 4 folks who are talking about the voucher conversation. Do you want to unmute yourself and discuss a little bit more so we can better understand?
Hey, Sarah, this is Gabe.
Hi, Gabe.
Hey, would it be helpful just to define what we mean by housing, access housing resources? I mean, in my mind, I thought that would be things like assistance in finding housing. It could be rent assistance or bill payment assistance, electric utility assistance. These are all housing resources, right? Or am I misunderstanding what we mean by that gray box?
No, I think you're understanding the gray box correctly. I think folks are wondering if we're talking about vouchers, right? If other vouchers need to be listed here that help the person access housing resources or access permanent housing or achieve housing security. Because one certainly can imagine, and again, if someone wants to unmute themselves so I'm not the person talking, that's great. But one can imagine that if housing security is the goal, the way might be to maintain and alleviate a little rent burden might be to give somebody a utility voucher or energy or heating assistance, or certainly as we approach inadequate housing, those vouchers or those kinds of resources might be what helps keep the person safe in the home. So I think that, yes, utilities do not necessarily nest under housing. There are more people who need utility assistance than housing. This is true. So that's one of the reasons why I wondered, as akin to how, and again, if someone wants to unmute themselves, that'd be lovely. But akin to how, hi, yes?
Hi, it's Mary Sarah from AWS. Hi. So what I'd like to know is behind the activities, is there like additional information, for example, where it's coming from or what the patient needs to do in order to access it? Because what I'm wondering is the different types of assistance are supported by different organizations, have different requirements behind them, and all of that information is important. A general category could be good, but not if it loses the detail of that.
That is really helpful. So one of the things we were just talking about is the collective requirement of creating definitions. So definitions that help people select things appropriately are definitely important. So as we craft our definitions, I think we'll try to keep the components of eligibility in mind. You'll see in the program definitions in HMIS submission, some of those components are there. So that's really important thing to consider. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing is that although more people need utilities than are at risk for losing their homes, the inability to pay utilities is one of the indicators for or predictors for evictions. So there is a close correlation.
Lovely. Okay, so we have, does anybody else want to offer off the mic, vocal conversation to the group, or do you want me to just parse the chat into submissions? Oh, tenant counseling. We do have some counseling elements in our activities. Yes, we're about to go forward to that page. This is just provision at this time.
Sarah?
Yes.
One of the things that I've experienced in other projects which are aimed at collecting reliable data is that once people become aware that there is a project to collect data, a lot of actors pile on, please collect data that helps me.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so one of the things that any data collection project needs to address is how deep do we go, depending on the actor who would really like more detail. And not knowing the actors present in this meeting, but hearing on the one hand, why don't we just say we're helping people? And on the other hand, we need to know exactly what the voucher was for and who it came from and how you qualified to get one. I'm really struggling with how do we decide what level of coding detail works for the clinical community that is actually funding and sponsoring this project. So I would just put that out there. There's a tremendous amount of detail that a huge universe of people would like to know about how clinicians in the health system can help people with housing.
Mm-hmm.
But within the clinical world, how much do we need to know besides we talked about housing and we made a referral and we hope they got a voucher and we hope they're safe in their home?
Hi, this is Lisa from SAS. working with a lot of EMR vendors, I think one of the things that they need to keep in mind is that they're still going to have clinical notes. Most of them will be templated. So there's going to be a significant amount of detail. So we'll still have that information to be able to drill down. So even when you say provision of emergency housing funds, or if you have a different type of voucher that's not specific, the details are going to be in a note somewhere that's usually structured. I don't think we're going to be able to highlight every single possibility in setting up these standards and codes.
I think, yeah, so this is Sarah. So both of you have really elegantly detailed one of the tensions we have within Gravity, which we really use the community to help us create a path for, is a balance between ease of use and granularity. Some of the drivers for our granularity are linked to policy and evaluating some of the policies and programs that our community partners have asked us to consider. But again, we always do try to create what we call the easy button. Again, not referencing anybody in particular, because some situations that level of granularity is just not practical. The other thing I want to say, which is something that a friend of mine says on a regular basis, is we're making a first attempt, right? And then these codes need to be tested, right? And we're not going anywhere, right? So we really look forward to having an understanding, an iterative understanding of how best to put these codes into practice, to test them, to refine them. So I think we're committed to that process as deeply as we are to this initial push. And then I think there's some other thought I have, but I forgot what it was. Does that sound like a good? So I do want to make sure folks trust me to try to capture the elements in the chat and submit them regarding the vouchers. Nice. Okay.
This is Brian Hanspicker.
Hi, Brian.
You were hoping for some additional voices besides your own. I thought I'd just chip in the notion that on the one hand, having an indication that someone is in need of utility assistance in general is probably a very valuable piece of information to have in the aftermath of provider engagement. That we probably don't need to have the gory detail of exactly which utility voucher was provided for which specific utility or utilities as a follow-on activity. And maybe just a generic vouchers were provided indicator. And I'm just throwing that out there on the table to see if there's if that helps to resolve this difference of expectations.
Yeah, I agree with Brian too. I think there's two components here. I think one, there should be some understanding around, particularly the voucher. I think for the clinical teams, knowing that someone is much at risk, that they're in need of a voucher is important, and also knowing that when you refer someone for a voucher, it's highly unlikely that they're going to get that in a timely amount. In a timely period of time, I guess, for lack of a better word. Housing vouchers generally for folks who are on the street will probably take a minimum of a year. For families who need a voucher, who are currently housed but are woefully underfunded for their housing, they could be looking at anywhere from 5 to 7 years before they have access to a voucher. And I think this is important from a clinical perspective because it gives you some insight on the amount of financial stress this family's under. And as a family needs some kind of utility assistance, getting utility assistance generally comes in the shape of 1 month of utility assistance. If you have a patient or a patient family who needs utility assistance, that's likely an indicator to you that this is a family who is under quite a bit of financial strain, because getting a utility assistance voucher for 1 month is not likely to alleviate that problem. Just to give some kind of insight.
Thank you, Joanne. I do want to state that we do have on our horizon addressing financial strain and utility concerns separately in their own domain in the future. And this kind of answers what Susan's mentioning to folks here. So what I heard from Brian, I heard seconded from folks, is that we could represent the connection to that kind of intervention in a broad enough way to move through this domain, and then maybe pick up further levels of granularity going forward. I also want to honor the fact what Joellen's saying is that because of the nature of the programs we're talking about here and because of wait lists, some of these things, the provision doesn't have necessarily the immediacy one's accustomed to in normal clinical settings. And usually these kinds of activities are being directed by a specialist, someone who's in and understands of the land there, and not necessarily like, for instance, myself, a family medicine provider. Definitely good points to keep in mind. All right, so I do want to make sure we keep on going. I'm going to try to parse the voucher conversation into a submission, and maybe it's actually worthy of an email after the fact, unless someone wants to submit themselves. Again, this is the beginning of the end-to-end review. So if there is a concept that we've talked about today that you feel like you've put your finger on, again, a missing concept, or these concepts are too granular and you don't think that they should be there, that's what the end-to-end review is for, is sending us an email, making a formal comment and saying, this is missing, this is too much, I suggest this. So I'm going to do my best to do that on our side, and then I really look forward to this conversation triggering some robust entries in our end-to-end review on interventions. All right, next slide, please. So this is some of the counseling components we were talking about. So as we were working on this through food insecurity, we realized that a lot of what the work of addressing social risks is coordination and counseling and continual engagement, because we're talking about things that are difficult to solve. So we did create domain-specific assessment and counseling codes regarding care planning and goal attainment. These mirror exact codes that we had for food insecurity. So we just brought them over and put them into the existing housing insecurity frame of work. You'll see that when we were talking about the parent concept, we do use the term housing insecurity as defined by HUD, which includes all of its subdomains. So we're looking forward to comments on this as well. We did hear counseling. I saw a counseling comment in the chat. So this is the slide I was referencing to look there when you're giving your end-to-end review comments to make sure your submission, your concept is being represented. Next slide, please.
Sarah?
Oh, hi, yes.
If you go back to that slide.
Yes, please.
The first two items refer to housing security, and all of the rest of the items refer to housing insecurity. Is that deliberate?
Yeah, so when we were working with our colleagues at the American Medical Association and even SNOMED, we had a meeting with them. When it comes to the goals are usually positive things. So as you can see in our little goals that we agreed on, so the goal is housing security. right? So assessment of progress toward goals to achieve housing security. So they're positively oriented, right? From a purpose of documenting in health records, care plans are usually focused on the concern at hand. So it switches from positive statements, my goal is housing security, to what am I going to do to solve my housing insecurity problem? Just like there's like a diabetes care plan or a depression care plan. So this is the convention we've taken, which we would love comments on, just trying to mirror the activities. Again, so goals being positively oriented, I'm heading that way. And then care planning being regarding like how do we assist the patient and the team and the community and the family towards addressing a certain problem.
I wonder if it would be helpful to have a footnote that explains what you just said in 2 sentences. We say housing security when we're talking about what we want to achieve, and we use housing insecurity when we're talking about interventions to get there. It's a nice distinction. I understand it perfectly, and I'm just wondering if it should be written down somewhere in the final product.
That sounds great, Lucy. Thank you. And I think because many people are doing the end-to-end review that are not on the call, like annotations and notes like that on the master might be really helpful because other people probably have the same question you do. So
thank you.
I want to just answer. So Brian asked a question regarding financial insecurity. That is 100% on our horizon. I can say that we are trying to figure out how to go forward in future domains, and financial strain and some of the effects on having enough money for different needs of life is definitely on that list with clear-sightedly. So Brian, you saw the future. And then Susan gave a lovely link. So Susan and I have had some lovely offline conversations regarding utility justice. She does a lovely link here for folks to get more information on that. Next slide, please. So this is just a homework section on. So we talked in the beginning about end-to-end review. So as of today, we have presented the findings of our master list for screening questions and answers. We did that 3 meetings ago. Last meeting, we presented on diagnoses and goals. And today, we talked about the interventions as they stand. So after these presentations now, we've done all the elements of the master. It is now, we look toward the community to comment in what's called this end-to-end review. So the Confluence has the master list. There's also these summary pages that Linda was referencing. So email any comment regarding any data element to the Gravity Project email. If you could possibly include the data element ID and number, and this is for when things are on the list, on the master list. Yes, thank you, Lucy. When things are on the list and you have comments on them, please include the ID element and the reason you feel like it's excessive. Like for instance, if someone wants to go back to those voucher elements and just say, absolutely, I think this is excessive, I think we should do X instead, you would reference that ID number and the reason why. If something's just not on there and you feel like it should be, like I had an aha that you're going to hear about in a few slides about a program or an organization that we haven't included yet, you would just submit it and you'd say, this is an intervention, it's not there, and it needs to be. So then include a description. And then if you are submitting a program, we really do appreciate definitions coming with those programs, because otherwise we have to try to figure out how to define them, which is a huge part of the work. And then if you're submitting screening elements, attach the copy to the tool. So we always, hypothetically speaking, the screening deadline was actually today, but we understand the grace of the period. It's challenging. So comments on the intervention submissions are due on the 6th of August. So that's like a month out. So if you have ideas, late breaking ideas in any of the activities, whether it be screening, diagnoses, goals, please just send us an email. We have a robust push, but please see that August deadline, because in August, we really hope to create this final set that then just rests and we vote in it collectively. Any questions, of course, write to me, write to Gravity. We're always here. Next slide, please. Any questions on that so far? Okay. Brief headline into inadequate housing. Again, so our work divided into two phases just because of the difference of the two domains, right? So we have housing insecurity as the whole concept. Within it are concepts of homelessness, housing instability, and inadequate housing. So Linda's going to first update us on inadequate housing data concept submissions, and then I'm going to have a brief little conversation. So Linda?
Thanks, Sarah. This is just quickly an overview again of the submission status to date. We still, as you can see on the project schedule, if you have any additional data elements for any of these activities to submit for inadequate housing, we're still accepting them. So please send them to us. We've gotten 3 so far. You can see here the status of what we've put on the master in these different 4 activity levels. And we welcome more feedback from people if you have other things that you think should belong on that master list for inadequate housing. And then I see, Sarah, it's back to you.
Okay, so the thing I'm going to say before we head into inadequate housing is that the number of submissions kind of belies the breadth of the submission itself, the master itself, because as we develop concepts that are included in common across social risks, we fold them into the appropriate next data set. So if you were to look at the inadequate housing submission, it's actually looking pretty good because there's things that we've learned that we want to say about people and how we try to help them. And these carry over. So now we're just going to briefly discuss some inadequate housing concepts, understanding that we're nearly to the end of our hour-long slot. I think we'll be okay though. Next slide, please. So again, just detailing some of the tools that we use so far. These are core tools that are then adapted into different screening tools. So Nuruzman et al. Is one of the core tools that's used across different tools, including the Accountable Health Communities tool. The American Housing Survey is the HUD tools, and Children's Health Watch has questions as well. So we're working collectively on defining inadequate housing in reference to the person. Existing definitions are regarding the house, so we are in the process of that. Next slide, please. This is, again, just to spark your mind. So when we think about data submission, we again have these buckets. We have screening tools, the questions we use, and the answers that we get, assessments or diagnoses, the goals of care. And you saw those in the initial slide for housing instability and homelessness. And again, some of those are broad enough that they will carry over into the inadequate housing work, and you can see them there. And then interventions, again, so we have program names and their definitions, people and professions, and then any applicable interventions, activities, or services. Next slide, please. So one of the things I really want to spark your mind on, because I feel like sometimes just asking questions, the community then offers, right? So regarding goals, so if inadequate housing is the problem, right, is adequate housing the goal? Like, we do not have an inadequate housing specific goal yet. So is it achieve adequate housing or access adequate housing, or is adequate housing actually not an appropriate concept at this time? There's actually some interesting, the conversation about adequate reminds me of how we used the word adequate when we were defining food insecurity, because what adequate means in the nutrition the American Academy of Nutrition definitions work. And then one of the things I want us to think about as well is that, are there strata of severity that's relevant for clinical considerations? So we've had these conversations, and this is across goals actually and diagnoses and assessment. I should have put a joint bullet there. So regarding food insecurity, we took care to consider food insecurity and its strata of severity and how relevant and what we needed to create to allow an assessment of risk in the moment. So we didn't just ask for a food insecurity concept or code. We asked for a strata of mild, moderate, or severe, knowing that severe food insecure individual has no food at home. And my response in the moment as a clinician might be more immediate, might be more urgent than if someone had mild food insecurity and they were more in a worry status. We did the same thing with housing. So homelessness, we considered stratas of severity and risk by dividing it up into sheltered versus unsheltered homelessness. So, oh, strata, thank you. Thank you, Lucy. So one of the things I want us to consider when it comes to inadequate housing is if there are stratum, thank you, that we need to consider here. So thinking about safe versus unsafe, right? Is there a concern regarding inadequate housing that says that someone's really unsafe right now and we need to do something now, versus someone is safe and they have minor structural concerns in the house that we want to address? Is that a concept that we need to consider as we go forward with building the diagnoses and goals here? That strata is something that we do see in the American Housing Survey assessment of housing. They do basically a spectrum of inadequacy, with severely inadequate houses as being really structurally unsafe.
Sarah?
Yeah?
You know, we're verging on a conversation here that becomes unconstitutionally vague. Unsafe versus safe. So I just want to clarify, safe from whose point of view? Safe from the patient's point of view? If the patient and the provider are divided by significant income, class, cultural differences,
Mm-hmm.
they may have very different understandings of what constitutes safe versus unsafe. So I just want to introduce that when we get into adjectives like that, or concepts, if we want to elevate this discussion, safe versus unsafe, the fire department would have one point of view, the police department would have another point of view, the mayor, I mean, this can really explode. So that's my thought just to start this conversation, and I'm sure it will go on for many meetings.
Yeah, so Lucy, I really appreciate that. So one thing I want to be clear of is that I do not suggest that unsafe versus safe are the concepts that we should use. It was the best lens I could think of to kind of.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
It's obviously it's provocative because of what I just said. So maybe there are other dichotomies that are more useful in a clinical setting.
Yeah, and I think so. Joellen had a really good point here. So I think akin to your statement of we can't assume someone wants different housing than they're in, right? So you were being very, very clear, and we were talking about in the goals that for some individuals who are unsheltered and homeless, they like it that way, and they have no desire for anything to change. So to assume otherwise is judgmental and not meeting the person where they are, right? So we will have these considerations in this conversation as well. And Joanne was talking about safety or the lack of it generally being defined by the patient similarly. So I think the hope was to get these things, because right now that you can see we have 3 submissions. So hopefully this conversation sparks people's curiosities. So look at the submission and see whether whether this kind of parsing out is necessary for inadequate housing, and if so, help us try to figure out what those concepts would be. I don't think in this instance, because we are talking about humans, the HUD perspective is sufficient. We have lots of wonderful comments on the side here about that might help us. But again, if you have ideas for refinement of inadequate housing, both in goals and assessments and diagnoses with this in mind, if you feel like this separation is important, please let us know and we'll talk about it in the future. Yes, and so Mark says, and some will balance risk, choosing some things that might be less safe because they meet other needs, balancing as a framework. And then safe and unsafe can vary depending on community circumstances. Yes, so overcrowding as a concept on safety especially becomes an issue in a pandemic, absolutely. So the last thing.
And don't forget the Hawaii perspective.
I know, the Hawaii perspective, I know, which reminds me of the bugs. We had our conversation about bugs last time.
Yes, insects, right.
We really, I love all these conversations. They're so wonderful. So I think you saw the programs that we had for housing, and homelessness. We do not have any as yet inadequate housing specific programs. We did have a concept regarding rehabilitation that we're trying to wordsmith a little bit. But sometimes I just throw things up on here. One of the things I was realizing we neglected across the board was referring to agencies on aging. So I would take care of family medicine. I refer to the area agency on aging all the time. So that was something I realized we've missed. Whether Habitat for Humanity might be a referral, there's all kinds of different options here. But I just wanted, again, sometimes I just throw things up in here in the slide to get people's juices flowing so we can start having a conversation. We are at time. We do have a half hour flex, but I also want to respect the fact that it is Thursday evening. I think that this was my kickoff conversation. Any thoughts regarding what we presented today? Anyone want to unmute and give some thoughts on this conversation regarding whether we need to parse out inadequate housing to get at severity from the perspective of the person, the patient, what the goal would be, because is the goal adequate housing, or is there some other way to state that this more person-centric again? And whether there are, what are the missing interventions, like what are the programs and professions and interventions that we would use?
Hi, this is Matt Bishop.
Hi, Matt.
I hope everybody's doing well. I just had a thought, and this may be too big to tackle, but there is a lot of research that shows that oftentimes people who live in communities with big houses that are separated from one another, that can lead to a form of social isolation that would go along with living in a big house. On the other hand, houses that are designed and architected in a certain way to encourage kind of community engagement and socialization between neighbors create a community fabric, and that is, a lot of research has shown is impactful for health, even if it's a smaller house. So I don't know if this is documented in standards or I'm not an expert on this topic, but I'm familiar with some of the research. So I just wondered if that was something that was possible to tackle, or if it was just kind of too far from what we're doing here.
Well, I don't know if anything's ever too far, because we're talking about people, right? And people are complex. So again, I do want to say that in reflecting on our kind of the limitations, I'd say, but even it's not really a limitation of really choosing 3 initial domains like food insecurity, housing, and transportation as our first push. We are trying to think in the future about how to kind of get more broad swaths of discussions that would allow us to think about intersecting risks, like what would it mean to consider multiple domains in short time frames to get maybe just even the diagnoses out. One of the things I want to answer, the reason why I'm saying that is we've always pushed to the periphery conversations about community and neighborhood because we've been talking about food insecurity in the person or, you know, the house I'm living in, right? But one of the things we would consider as being important to consider if we go forward with thinking about multiple domains at once, trying to get certainly diagnostic concepts more quickly, would be the requirement of thinking about the environment, the safety of the neighborhood, right? The food available in my neighborhood, right? So I don't think anything is out of left field when we're talking about people. But if you have ideas for concepts, you can submit them. And then what we've been doing with some of these more broad concepts, if it doesn't seem to necessarily meet the domain that we're specifically talking about, we put them again in the parking lot. So we talk about them, we put them in this place where they're safe. So when we revisit something, maybe perhaps the neighborhood element, the environment element, the community element, the rurality element, we can bring them back to the fore. Oh, as a Canadian, hope I'm allowed to be here. Yes, you are. The ban on border crossing does not count to presence in the Gravity Project. Public health nursing. Yes, we do need to add public health nursing. Okay, and visiting nurses. Okay, so all of these things we'll parse into, again, submissions, and we'll work through the process. So welcome, David Rees, the Canadian. So next slide, please. I want to pass through, so next slide. This, and then here we are. So yeah, all right. The list of homework grows. So in general, if you're new to the group, welcome. There is a lot of material to catch up on the Confluence page. There's a link to the Confluence. You can go there and review the work we did on food insecurity, the work we're doing on housing instability and homelessness, and the work we're doing on inadequate housing. You can review some of our announcements. The task at hand right now is you heard us in the beginning of the conversation talking about housing instability and homelessness. We now have what we're talking about being a fairly representative set of information regarding screening, diagnoses, goals, and interventions. Review it. So we hope to have your review of it. We're here to assist with that process. Send comments again via email. This presentation and all the instructions on how to do the end-to-end review are on the Confluence. And then in the second half of the conversation, you heard us talking about inadequate housing. So I have my little Spark slide. So consider what the goal might be. Consider whether we needed to parse out inadequate housing into any kind of concepts that represent risk. It's a month from now for the housing instability and homelessness data. So we have a month. So it's August 6th, I think. I forget. Was the Thursday of the first week of August. And then, so for inadequate housing, we're just rolling with that work. So again, submit new concepts. There's an online tool. There's an Excel spreadsheet you can download, or you can just email us. You can email us and say, Sarah, Gravity, this is my idea, and then we can parse it into the tool, into the master for you, into submission. It's our commitment to make this very large process as accessible as possible as we can for all of you. We are 100% here. Even if you want to send me an email, my information's on the Confluence as well. August 6th, yeah, I think that's what it is. Next slide, please.
Sarah, before you leave that one.
Yeah, please go back. Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. You know that I have voiced distress about finding my way around Confluence, can I just ask you if we know this first link, which I now have stored, can we find the other two that you've got here? If we go to this first link, is there going to be a sentence or a headline or something that refers us to these other two?
You know what we will, so every Tuesday after a public call, we send out an email with these links in it.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
No, I think, but I do want to honor the fact that our Confluence gets better and better because we do have a lovely communications person, Marissa, who's helping us there. And we are building a better public facing web page that is less technical. In the meantime, if again, so every Tuesday we send out the summary of the public call. I think it's Tuesday, it's scheduled. And then, of course, if anyone again says, can you please help me just find what I need to do? Send an email to Gravity. We will reply here, and we will directly to you. You do not have. You're not a herd. We want to help everyone. So if you have any questions about accessing anything ever, just send us an email, and we're here to help.
Yeah, but it's much more efficient to have one link that then branches into 20 different directions instead
True.
of.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Gabe is our user testimonial. He's our little Yelp. He's saying Tuesday emails very helpful, and I've definitely noticed the improvements to the Confluence navigation. Thank you, Gabe. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I think that's the final bit here. Join the Gravity Project. There we go. So, and then these are the overview slides that we're including every time. Again, so if you want to reference them. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah.
We're so
Terrific.
grateful for your engagement, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.